January 28, 1986, was supposed to be a milestone year for NASA's shuttle program. The Space Shuttle Challenger sat on Pad 39B at Kennedy Space Center, ready for mission STS-51L. The crew included Krista McAuliffe, the first teacher chosen to fly in space under the Teacher in Space project. The launch was part of an ambitious push to make spaceflight routine, with a record number of flights planned. But 73 seconds after liftoff, at 11:38 a.m. power, the vehicle broke apart over the Atlantic. All 7 astronauts were lost. The explosion was not a random act of fate, it was the culmination of a known engineering risk, a cold weather warning, and a decision chain that had turned a documented seal problem into an acceptable flight condition. The solid rocket boosters, or SRBs, were the largest ever built for spaceflight. Each 149-foot segment was joined by a field joint, a tang and clevis assembly sealed by 2 rubber O-rings. The primary O-ring was supposed to compress against the clevis wall, sealing hot combustion gases inside. A secondary O-ring provided backup. But the design had a critical vulnerability when the booster ignited. Internal pressure caused the joint to rotate slightly, opening a gap. If the O-rings could not track that movement quickly enough, a blow-by of superheated gas could occur. The O-rings were classified as Criticality 1 components, meaning their failure would result in loss of vehicle and crew. That's exactly what the Rogers Commission later found had happened on Challenger. O-ring problems weren't new. In the years before Challenger, NASA and contractor Morton Thiokol recorded erosion or blow-by on 6 previous flights. After STS-51C in January 1985, the coldest launch before Challenger, O-ring damage was the worst yet seen. According to the Rogers Commission, those incidents were presented at flight readiness reviews, but an informal acceptance took root. Erosion was happening within predictable bounds and did not endanger the mission. Engineers were concerned, but the system lacked a clear threshold below which damage was considered unsafe. The erosion pattern chipped away at engineering margins, and by late 1985, the risk had become normalized. NASA's flight readiness review was meant to certify every component before flight. But as the Rogers Commission observed, the process treated recurring O-ring problems as acceptable risk rather than as signs of a systematic flaw. Waivers were issued to fly with known seal erosion. The Commission wrote that the genesis of the Challenger accident was not a simple mechanical failure but traced back to decisions made during the program's design and risk management. The waiver system became an administrative hurdle rather than a safety gate, and the Flight Readiness Review never formally escalated the O-ring issue as an unresolved hazard. The solid rocket booster joint had been accepted despite Thiokol's low design rating during the 1974 source selection, where cost was the primary factor. When NASA awarded the solid rocket booster contract in 1974, it chose Morton Thiokol for a cost-plus award fee deal worth roughly $800 million. According to the Commission, Thiokol ranked 4th out of 5 competitors in design and verification but first in management and second in manufacturing. NASA's selection board cited cost advantages that were substantial and consistent. The joint design was noted as a positive, yet it would become the single point of failure. The Commission's historical analysis suggested that NASA's early decision to prioritize cost and schedule over design robustness set the stage for future risk acceptance. Over a decade, the agency had invested heavily in this design, creating institutional inertia that made it harder to question the joint's safety, even as evidence of erosion accumulated. On January 27, 1986, forecasters predicted overnight lows of 18 FE at the launch site, with launch time temperatures in the low 30s, far below the 53 FE previously certified for the O-rings. That evening, a teleconference connected NASA, Thiokol management, and Thiokol engineers in Utah. The engineers, citing data from prior cold flights and test results, recommended against launching because the seals would lose resiliency and might not seat properly. The debate centered on whether the cold would prevent the O-rings from sealing in time. The engineers presented data showing temperature-dependent performance, but the discussion lacked a definitive temperature criterion, leaving room for judgment. The conference call lasted hours, and the initial no-launch stance from the engineers slowly shifted as managers probed the certainty of the risk. After a private caucus away from the engineers, Thiokol management, including Senior Vice President Gerald Mason, reversed the recommendation. According to the congressional report that followed, managers felt schedule pressure from NASA, which wanted to maintain the launch manifest. The Commission highlighted the moment a management decision to launch occurred in spite of the concerns. No launch commit criteria existed for cold O-rings, so NASA's launch decision memo signed off. The management override was a pivotal moment that the Commission later dissected, concluding that the decision to launch was not supported by a rigorous risk assessment. NASA's then Associate Administrator for Spaceflight, Jesse Moore, later acknowledged he had not been fully briefed on the engineers' no-launch stance. At 11:38 a.m. on January 28, Challenger lifted off. Video telemetry recorded a black plume emerging from the right SRB aft joint at about 58 seconds. By 64 seconds, the plume had intensified and deflected toward the external tank's lower ring frame. At 73 seconds, the tank's hydrogen structure failed, igniting a massive fireball. The orbiter was torn apart by aerodynamic forces. The crew cabin separated and continued upward before falling to the ocean. The plume was captured on video, and later analysis of recovered wreckage confirmed that the primary O-ring had fully burned through and the secondary had partially failed, allowing a path for the hot gas. The Commission's forensic analysis confirmed that the O-ring breach was the root cause, triggered by cold-induced loss of seal resiliency. 6 days after the launch, on February 3, President Reagan established the Presidential Commission on the Space Shuttle Challenger accident, chaired by former Secretary of State William P. Rogers. The move was deliberately independent, unlike the Apollo 1 fire in 1967, where NASA investigated itself. The White House sought an external review to ensure objectivity. The 13-member panel included astronauts Neil Armstrong and Sally Ride, physicist Richard Feynman, and other experts from engineering and aviation. Over 4 months, the Commission held hearings, subpoenaed documents, and conducted tests on recovered hardware. They reviewed all available mission data, performed cold weather tests on O-rings, and analyzed fractured joint components. Their 5-volume report, released June 6, 1986, would become one of the most cited accident investigations in engineering history. Chapter 4 of the Commission report detailed the failure chain. The O-ring in the right SRB's aft field joint lost its elasticity in the cold. Below 30 F, it could not seal the joint gap. Hot combustion gas at 5,000 ppm cut a path through the primary and partially through the secondary seal. The escaping gas impinged on the external tank, breaching its structure. The failure sequence began with joint rotation opening a gap, allowing gas to act like a blowtorch on the tank. The Commission found no evidence of sabotage, main engine failure, or payload mishap. The physical cause was the destruction of the seals that are intended to prevent hot gases from leaking through the joint. It was an engineering problem made fatal by temperature. Beyond the physical failure, the Commission identified a flawed decision-making culture. They concluded that NASA's organizational structure combined with schedule pressure to suppress dissenting views. Engineers' warnings were filtered out before reaching senior launch officials. The report stated, failures in communication during ulterior omittionssex, nien with sen schwanigkicker.
Led to a launch decision based on incomplete and sometimes misleading information. The term groupthink was later used by analysts to describe the conformity. The Commission recommended establishing an independent safety office with the power to halt flights, mandatory documentation of dissenting opinions, and a requirement that all critical components have a quantified risk threshold. The problem was not just a bad O-ring, it was a system that allowed the risk to persist.
The House Committee on Science and Technology issued its own report in October 1986, echoing the Commission's findings. It highlighted the lack of formal risk data and the ad hoc way O-ring concerns were handled. In response, NASA grounded the shuttle fleet for 32 months. The solid rocket booster joint was completely redesigned. A third O-ring was added, the tang and clevis interlocking improved, and heaters were installed to keep the seals warm. The fix was verified through extensive ground testing and independent oversight. The return-to-flight mission STS-26 launched in September 1988 under Rear Admiral Richard Truly's leadership with a mandate to fix the safety culture. No Challenger-era joint ever flew again, and the redesigned boosters performed without critical failure throughout the shuttle program's remainder. The Challenger accident became a defining case study in engineering ethics, risk communication, and organizational behavior. The phrase normalization of deviance, coined later by sociologist Diane Vaughan, captures how repeated success with a flawed design can dull risk perception. Every engineering student now studies the teleconference and the failed O-ring. The names of the crew, Scobie, Smith, Onizuka, Resnick, McNair, McAuliffe, Jarvis, are memorialized in schools and scholarships. But the deepest legacy is the institutional memory, that a system designed to explore the cosmos can be brought down by a small rubber seal and a larger failure to listen. The accident's influence extends beyond aerospace. It is studied in medical error prevention, nuclear safety, and any field where technical dissent must overcome hierarchy. The 7 crew members are remembered not just as victims but as contributors to a lesson that still saves lives.